Michael Moore, the iconic documentary filmmaker known for his fiery progressive stance, found himself in an unexpected spotlight, and not the kind he's used to. The moment came live on air, and the aftershocks were unmistakable. It wasn't a crafted segment or an editorial rant that set things ablaze. It was a single sentence dropped with precision by former Trump official Kash Patel. A sentence that sliced through the media fog and landed with devastating clarity. Patel, a sharp and relentless political insider, has never been shy about confronting what he views as the hypocrisy and manipulations of mainstream media elites. But this moment was different. Sitting across from the host, staring directly into the camera, he delivered a line that seemed to make time freeze. They were never afraid of Trump. They were afraid of the truth he exposed, and people like Michael Moore helped hide it. That was all it took. The tension in the studio, already taut, snapped like a wire under pressure. Reactions were immediate. Moore, who wasn't physically present but whose name hung heavy in the air, became the centerpiece of a narrative he couldn't control. Social media erupted, clips spread like wildfire, and it wasn't just Patel's words, it was the raw, undeniable response they triggered. The camera cut briefly to the panel. Even through the trained media polish you could see it. Discomfort, unease, a flicker of panic. The kind that doesn't come from being insulted, but from realizing a deeply uncomfortable truth has just been said aloud, in front of millions. For years, Moore positioned himself as a voice of the working class, a crusader against corporate greed, war, and establishment narratives. But to many, particularly in the populist right, his voice has shifted, becoming less about challenging power and more about defending a deeply entrenched liberal order. Patel tapped into that perception with chilling accuracy. And the fallout revealed how close to the bone he struck. Within minutes, media watchdogs leapt to Moore's defense. Editorials were drafted. Hashtags started trending. Some called Patel's comment irresponsible, baseless, or even dangerous. But the most revealing response wasn't the media's. It was the silence, or carefully crafted, avoidance from Moore himself. Known for his quick rebuttals and viral online posts, he said, "Nothing." That silence grew louder with each passing hour. By the next morning, pundits were debating not just what Patel said, but why Moore hadn't responded. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't about personal insult. It was about credibility, legacy, and the unraveling of a carefully curated image. Moore's critics, long frustrated by what they see as his selective outrage and elite status masked in blue-collar aesthetics, found a rare moment of vindication. Patel didn't just criticize Moore, he punctured the illusion. He forced a reckoning between what Moore once stood for and what he's now perceived to protect. This wasn't about a culture war zinger. It was strategic and deeply personal. Patel knew the symbolic weight Moore carried. He represents more than a filmmaker. He represents an era of liberal activism that, to many Americans, feels increasingly disconnected from reality on the ground. Inflation, border chaos, global instability, and yet figures like Moore are still talking about Trump as the ultimate threat, as if the current unraveling is invisible. By striking at that symbolism, Patel redirected the conversation. He shifted the spotlight from Trump's controversies to the architects of the narrative against him. And judging by the reaction, it worked. In media, silence is rarely neutral. It's either a pause for strategy or a pause born of being blindsided. In this case, the latter seems more likely. Whether or not Moore eventually responds, the damage was already done. Viewers saw something raw and unrehearsed, the truth hitting harder than any scripted debate could. It wasn't just Moore who felt the impact. It was the entire media ecosystem built around defending a fragile narrative. And for one searing moment, on live TV, that narrative cracked. What came through wasn't just a political jab. It was a challenge to an entire worldview. And judging by their reaction, they weren't ready for it. The days that followed only intensified the firestorm. Conservative commentators seized on the moment like sharks scenting blood. Clips of the exchange played repeatedly on right-wing media, dissected frame by frame. But what struck viewers most wasn't just the words Kash Patel had spoken. It was the visible discomfort it triggered in the establishment voices, who'd long dismissed figures like him. This wasn't just political theater. It was a turning point in the ongoing cultural shift where legacy media, once untouchable, now faces real-time judgment from the public they claim to serve. And Moore, once hailed as a rebellious voice of the people, found himself cast, fairly or not, as part of the very establishment his early films used to rail against. Comment sections across platforms reflected a wave of disillusionment. Former fans of Moore expressed their disappointment. "He used to speak for us," one user wrote, "but now he's just another gatekeeper pretending to be a rebel." That sentiment, echoed thousands of times, carried more weight than any editorial defense. The political terrain has shifted dramatically over the last decade. Populism, both on the left and right, has forced a reckoning with entrenched power. Figures like Patel, once seen as fringe, are now speaking for a growing segment of Americans who feel betrayed by the institutions they once trusted, including the media, Hollywood, and even progressive icons like Moore. What Kash Patel did in that moment wasn't just deliver a soundbite. He reframed the conversation. He drew a clear line between the perceived truth-tellers of the past and the emerging voices of a new, skeptical generation. And in doing so, he exposed a vulnerability in the old guard, not just in their ideology but in their confidence. The backlash against Patel was predictable, even routine. Outrage tweets, op-eds questioning his motives, television analysts dismissing him as a conspiracy theorist. But underneath that surface fury was a deeper, more unsettling truth for Moore's defenders. The audience was listening to Patel. And, more importantly, they weren't laughing him off. Moore's eventual response when it came was cautious, almost painfully so. In a pre-recorded podcast, he made passing reference to certain bad faith actors trying to distract the public from real issues. But the response felt distant, rehearsed, even hollow. Gone was the firebrand energy, the unfiltered rage that made Fahrenheit 9/11 or Bowling for Columbine cultural touchstones. In its place was the tired voice of someone trying to hold the center together while the ground shifts beneath him. This isn't to say Michael Moore is finished. He remains a skilled filmmaker and a sharp commentator. But the aura, the perception of him as a fearless outsider, took a hit that night. And in the age of instant feedback and viral narratives, perception is everything. Kash Patel didn't just launch a political attack. He lit a flare in a room full of dry tinder. He exposed the fragility of the image that many progressive icons have built for themselves. And while Moore's career won't crumble from one viral moment, the crack is there. The public saw it. They felt it. And some of them, for the first time, questioned what side he's really on. That's the power of live truth in an age of manufactured consensus. It doesn't shout, it cuts. And once it does, there's no going back. The ripple effects didn't stop with Moore or Patel. Within political circles, think tanks, and media green rooms, the moment became a quiet warning. The landscape is changing, and so are the rules of engagement. What was once a clear divide between left and right is now increasingly blurred by a deeper divide, between insiders and outsiders, between those who craft the narrative and those who tear it down. Patel, often portrayed as a partisan attack dog, is becoming something more complicated, a symbol of defiance against a media apparatus many Americans no longer trust. And that scares the establishment, not because of who Patel is, but because of what he represents. A new breed of communicator who doesn't play by the old rules, who can say something blunt, unscripted, and still command attention across ideological lines. This shift terrifies media veterans like Moore, who rose to prominence in a very different world, one where the gatekeepers held the microphones and the audience had to listen. Now with platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Rumble, and a decentralized network of podcasts and live streams, control of the narrative has been shattered. It's no longer enough to be loud or provocative. The public is hungry for authenticity, for someone who tells the truth as they see it, no matter the cost. And that's what Patel delivered. The panic wasn't just emotional. It was institutional. You could see it in the coordinated response. Media figures rallying to Moore's defense, framing the story as a right-wing smear instead of asking the hard question, why did it land so hard? Because deep down, even Moore's supporters know that the version of him who once stood outside General Motors and Roger and Me, confronting corporate greed with a microphone and a camera, wouldn't recognize the version now attending Hollywood dinners and rubbing shoulders with political elites. The working-class persona hasn't changed in voice, but the audience senses the disconnect. Patel exposed it, and once a truth like that is spoken aloud, it doesn't fade. It echoes. It starts conversations in homes and coffee shops and group chats across the country. Not because Kash Patel is a household name, but because he tapped into something people already felt, something they hadn't dared say out loud. That maybe the people claiming to speak for them haven't been listening. For a very long time. Moore may continue making films and Patel may continue making headlines. But what happened in that live exchange transcended both men. It was a flashpoint, a clash of two political eras, two cultural energies, two different Americas, and in that collision, a truth emerged that no editing room could erase, no headline could reframe, and no silence could smother. For those watching closely, it was a moment of reckoning, not just for Michael Moore, but for the entire machine that built him. And now, as the dust continues to settle, that reckoning is beginning to take shape in very real, tangible ways. Among Moore's traditional audience, the disillusioned middle class, the economically squeezed, the politically betrayed, the cracks are widening. It's not that they've suddenly turned against him. It's more subtle, more telling. They've stopped listening with the same trust. The blind loyalty is gone, the instinctive nod, the automatic cheer, the belief that he's one of us. It's been replaced by hesitation, scrutiny, doubt, and that's the beginning of the end for any public figure, not being hated, but being questioned. When Patel spoke, he wasn't just aiming at Moore. He was aiming at the media monolith Moore had come to symbolize. The carefully constructed narrative architecture that presents itself as rebellious while protecting. The very status quo it claims to oppose. For millions of viewers, it was like seeing the curtain pulled back. The so-called radicals, it turned out, might just be guardians of the old order in new clothes. In response, the establishment has ramped up its efforts to reassert control. Talk show circuits began reintroducing Moore more frequently, subtly, reinforcing his activist image. Opinion columns popped up defending his legacy, painting Patel's remark as an attack on journalism. But even those pieces felt more like damage control than conviction. The language was defensive, the tone anxious. It was as if they were trying to patch a dam they knew was already leaking. And here's where things get even more interesting. Patel didn't need to say anything else. He didn't go on a media tour. He didn't release a follow-up video. He didn't engage in a Twitter war. He let the moment sit. And it festered. That restraint spoke volumes. It suggested confidence. It suggested he knew the impact had landed, and that more words would only dilute the power of what was already said. In an age where everyone is shouting, silence, especially from the one who threw the punch, can be the most unsettling response of all. Meanwhile, the grassroots have taken notice. Independent creators, podcast hosts, street journalists, they've picked up the baton. They're revisiting Moore's past statements, comparing them to his current positions and asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. The kind of questions legacy media refuses to ask. And while this movement is decentralized, it's relentless. It doesn't move on. It doesn't forget. It builds. Moore, of course, will survive this. His career is long and his impact undeniable. But he now exists in a different context. No longer the uncontested voice of the people, but a symbol caught in the crossfire of a cultural transition. A once defiant filmmaker whose silence, in the face of a direct challenge, now feels less like wisdom and more like retreat. The world has changed. The public has changed. And Moore's place within that world is no longer guaranteed. Kash Patel understood this. That's why his words hit so hard. Not because they were loud, but because they were timely. A single scalpel slice through. layers of illusion. And as the days go on, that moment will be remembered not just as a media shock but as a turning point. When the narrative began to shift, when the mask slipped, and when the people watching at home started asking, who's really fighting for us? Because once a question like that takes root, it doesn't go away, it grows. It grows in whispers at kitchen tables, in late-night texts between friends, in quiet realizations while watching the evening news. It grows every time a carefully curated headline feels just a little too polished, a little too aligned with power, and not with the people. It grows every time someone who once felt represented by the likes of more now feels spoken at instead of for. That's the lasting impact of a moment like the one Patel created. It becomes more than a media clip. It becomes a crack in the foundation. And cracks, given time and pressure, don't go away. They spread. The establishment's efforts to contain the fallout only highlight how sensitive they are to the shift. They've long relied on cultural arbiters like Moore to maintain the illusion of dissent, while keeping the core systems of control untouched. Moore's documentaries never really turned the system upside down. They aired grievances, yes, but they stopped short of challenging the real machinery behind it all. In retrospect, some viewers now see that clearly. The anger was real, the stories were important, but the solutions? Always vague, always just enough to stir the pot without breaking it. That's what Patel's comment blew wide open. It wasn't just a jab at Moore's credibility. It was a direct challenge to a whole class of media figures who brand themselves as resistance while living comfortably within the very institutions they claim to fight. And now, that challenge has echoed beyond TV screens. It's sparked a deeper evaluation of who we trust and why. Meanwhile, the political class is taking note. There's a growing awareness, even among those traditionally opposed to Patel and what he represents, that something is shifting beneath their feet. Voters aren't responding to the old cues. They're not rallying behind the same faces, the same slogans, or the same fear tactics. They're starting to see through the theater. And that, more than any single quote or clip, is what rattles the establishment most. The realization that their hold on public perception is slipping. That their trusted messengers are being questioned, not just by critics, but by former fans. That people are no longer satisfied with slogans, edits, or outrage. They want the truth, raw and uncomfortable as it may be. So yes, Michael Moore will continue to speak. He may even return to form in future projects. But he'll do so under a different light now. Not as a man above reproach, but as one whose image was challenged in public, and whose silence spoke louder than any defense. And Kash Patel, whether one agrees with his politics or not, he has cemented something rare in today's media landscape. A moment of clarity that couldn't be spun away. In a world drowning in noise, spin, and spectacle, he dropped a single line that exposed the shaky scaffolding of the media elite. And for those watching, really watching, it became a moment they couldn't unsee. That's the thing about truth. Once spoken, it doesn't fade. It lingers. It spreads. And it changes everything. And as it spreads, it begins to redraw the lines of influence, not just in politics or media, but in the hearts and minds of everyday Americans who no longer see themselves reflected in the institutions that once claimed to represent them. The aftermath of Patel's moment is now echoing across a broader cultural spectrum. On college campuses, in online communities, in local town halls and independent broadcasts, people are asking tougher questions, not just about politicians, but about the messengers themselves. Who funds them? Who protects them? Who decides which voices get amplified and which get silenced? For years, the progressive left had a monopoly on cultural critique. Figures like Michael Moore were elevated not because they were the only ones challenging power, but because they did so within acceptable boundaries. They pointed fingers but never shattered the game board. That's why they were allowed to flourish. And now that contract is expiring. The new wave of cultural critics, whether they come from the right or simply outside traditional politics, are no longer interested in playing by those rules. They aren't asking for permission. They aren't courting legacy validation. They're broadcasting directly to the people, unfiltered, unscripted, and often unrelenting. That's the real disruption. Moore's defenders may argue this is dangerous, that it leads to misinformation, chaos, populism. But what they miss is that the genie is already out of the bottle. The public has seen too much, learned too much, and been burned too often to go back to trusting any one side blindly. That's not chaos. That's clarity. Painful, disruptive, but necessary. It's why Moore's moment of silence wasn't just a strategic pause. It was an admission, conscious or not, that the ground has shifted. That the old tactics of dismissal and ridicule no longer work when the audience is already halfway out the door. And for those watching at home, those who once admired Moore's fire but now see it as flickering, there's a sobering realization. Maybe the truth was never about who shouts the loudest, but who dares to say what others won't when it matters most. Kash Patel didn't just name names, he named the game. He pulled back the curtain not just on a person, but on a system of managed dissent, and in doing so, he turned one moment into a movement. A push for unvarnished reality in a culture drowning in curated illusion. It's not about Moore versus Patel anymore. It's about something much bigger. A collective awakening. A mass rethinking of who we believe and why we ever believe them. And once that process begins, it doesn't reverse, it only accelerates. Now that the acceleration has begun, the consequences are becoming more visible, more measurable, and far harder to contain. The media landscape is fracturing at a rate no one anticipated. Independent platforms are flourishing, fueled not by institutional funding but by grassroots support and an audience that's grown immune to polished talking points. These aren't just fringe channels shouting into the void. They're becoming the primary sources of information for millions who feel abandoned by the legacy press. That shift terrifies the old guard. Figures like Michael Moore, once hailed as vanguards of truth, are now caught in a paradigm they helped create but no longer control. Their narratives, once gospel to progressive audiences, are now parsed with suspicion, fact-checked by the very people who once quoted them as gospel. And the shift isn't limited to ideology, it's generational. Younger viewers, especially Gen Z and younger millennials, aren't watching cable news. They aren't reading op-eds from establishment columnists or clinging to legacy filmmakers for political guidance. They're gravitating toward authenticity, and they're ruthlessly good at sniffing out inauthenticity. Patel's moment hit a nerve not because it was packaged, but because it felt raw, direct, and unscripted. It was real, or at least real enough to disrupt the performance around it. Moore, by contrast, is a filmmaker, a master of storytelling. But even the most compelling narrative loses its grip if the audience no longer believes the storyteller is outside the system. And when someone like Patel, unpolished, unfiltered, unconcerned with media etiquette, calls that out in front of a national audience, it forces a re-evaluation. That's what's happening now. Quietly but powerfully, people are re-evaluating not just Moore, but all the voices they once trusted. They're asking, who's profiting from the outrage? Who's using our fear to sell films, books, or ad space? Who's giving us truth? And who's selling us a polished product designed to feel like truth but engineered for safe consumption? Patel's comment was not just a verbal jab. It was a dare, a challenge to look beyond the comforting narratives and face the uncomfortable possibility that some of the loudest critics of the system may, in fact, be among its most effective guardians. And what makes this even more disruptive is that Patel didn't need mainstream approval to make it land. He bypassed the gatekeepers and spoke directly to the people. And they listened. Not all, but enough to shift the weight. In many ways, this moment is symbolic of a larger collision, not just of politics, but of worldviews. On one side, you have those clinging to the institutions, desperate to preserve their influence, still operating under the belief that control of the narrative means control of the people. On the other side, you have those who have stopped waiting for permission, content creators, whistleblowers, commentators, and everyday Americans who are building their own narratives, their own platforms, and ultimately, their own reality. This isn't a temporary backlash. It's a realignment Michael Moore will continue creating. He may even release a powerful documentary that stirs emotion and sparks headlines. But the reception will be different now. The scrutiny sharper, the applause quieter, because a moment of truth once seen reshapes the lens through which all future messages are viewed. And for the establishment, that's the most dangerous outcome of all. Not that they're being opposed, but that they're being ignored. Patel lit the fuse. And whether you agree with him or not, you can't deny the explosion that followed. It wasn't just about calling out one man. It was about exposing a system of controlled outrage, managed dissent and comfortable rebellion, and daring the public to walk away from it. It turns out many already have. The rest are now following. They're following not with torches and pitchforks, but with unsubscribes, scrolls, silence. The modern forms of rejection that hurt far more than public protests ever did. Because this isn't just about backlash. It's about irrelevance. And for a media figure or cultural icon, irrelevance is the final verdict, one you can't negotiate with. What Patel sparked was more than a disruption. It was a mirror. A moment when many in the audience finally saw clearly that the emperor had no clothes, or at the very least was wearing the uniform of a machine he once claimed to fight. That realization doesn't breed rage. It breeds detachment, and detachment is fatal to influence. The deeper this awakening spreads, the more the public starts reclaiming power in the one way that truly matters. Attention. They're choosing where they look, who they trust, who they support. They're moving toward voices that don't just perform authenticity, but live it. Flawed, raw, inconsistent, maybe even controversial, but undeniably real. And that's something the polished machines of narrative production can't replicate. They can imitate the language, mimic the tone, copy the urgency, but they can't manufacture genuine trust. Once lost, that kind of trust can't be bought back with clever editing or emotional music scores. It has to be earned, or in Patel's case, seized. Michael Moore's legacy won't be erased. He'll still be studied in film schools, referenced in political history, maybe even praised for what he accomplished in a different era. But in this era, this brutally transparent, hyper-reactive, trust-starved era, his silence in the face of Patel's accusation has become its own kind of message. And it's one the public heard loud and clear. It says, he doesn't want this fight. And in a time when people are desperate for fighters, not figureheads, that's more than a misstep. That's a missed moment, the kind you don't get back. Meanwhile, Patel doesn't need to convince everyone. He's already succeeded by breaking the illusion for just a few more people. Enough to shift the conversation, enough to widen the cracks, enough to keep the pressure building. Because when those cracks become fractures, it won't matter how iconic your past is. It won't matter how many awards you've won or how many standing ovations you've received. The only thing that will matter is whether people still believe you're speaking for them or at them. Michael Moore, in that moment, didn't speak at all, and that silence now echoes louder than anything he's ever said. That silence now echoes louder than anything he's ever said, not just as a lapse in commentary, but as a symbol of something far greater, the collapse of assumed credibility. It marked a clear divide between two eras, one defined by legacy, prestige, and curated dissent, and another raw and unpredictable, driven by individuals willing to challenge the system from the outside. Moore represented the former. For decades, he had the voice of the rebel, the scrappy outsider with a camera and a cause. But in that one moment, stripped of response, he appeared no longer as a rebel, but as a relic. And in his place, Kash Patel stood firm. Whether you align with him politically or not is beside the point. The point is that he spoke without flinching, not to shock, but to reveal. And when his words landed, there was no walking them back, no reframe slick enough to put the truth back in its box. That is the power of a cultural turning point. Now, the audience, once passive, now alert, is watching with new eyes. They are no longer willing to accept prepackaged outrage or performance activism. They want answers. They want sincerity. And they want leaders who don't just say they fight for the people, but prove it. by standing their ground when the moment demands it. Moore missed that moment. He blinked, and while he may still have platforms, allies, and the favor of institutions that fear losing him, the real audience, the one that matters, has started to move on. In the end, this wasn't just a story about two men on opposite sides of the political spectrum. It was a story about clarity piercing through noise, about truth, however messy, overpowering performance, and about a country, weary and skeptical, beginning to awaken from its long trance. So the next time someone like Moore takes the stage or releases a film or delivers a monologue, the applause may still come, but it will be cautious, fragmented, and thinner than before, because somewhere in the crowd someone will remember the silence, and someone else will remember the words that caused it. That's how narratives collapse. That's how new ones begin. And that's how, in one unscripted moment, the balance of truth shifted, permanently.